Hello, this is the 275th edition of Catch of the Day, available on the Branch Talk YouTube channel. Today we're going to continue reading from a book written by Trent Wildy, entitled The King of Crisis in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Starting at the beginning of the last sentence on page 23, we read, the influence of Egypt never really went away, and in the time of Hosea, it was still present in virtually every aspect of life, whether political, cultural, or religious. Halfway through the 8th century, about the time Hosea began his ministry, Assyria was led by her new king, Tiglath-Pileser III, on a campaign from the northeast down toward the border of Egypt. Assyria and Egypt were vying for dominance, and Israel was caught dead in the middle. Another important thing to know is that almost 200 years before Hosea's time, the united monarchy of Israel came to an end. What was once a united kingdom of 12 tribes was now 2 separate kingdoms. Israel in the north, composed of 10 tribes, and Judah in the south, composed of 2 tribes. These 2 kingdoms each had their own kings, laws, borders, religious centers, international relations, etc. Sometimes there was relative peace between them, while at other times they were at all-out war. Hosea's prophecies were mostly concerned with Israel, though he did have his fair share of things to say about Judah as well. He had warnings for both kingdoms, but he was especially focused on warning Israel of her imminent end. 1, verse 4, 5, 9, 7, 8, and 9, 13, 9, 3, 15, and 17. Overview of the book of Hosea. The book of Hosea is naturally divided into 3 separate sections. Here is a brief overview of each of them. Section 1, Hosea 1 and 2. These first 2 chapters narrate the story of the beginning of Hosea's prophetic ministry. They explain that God used Hosea's marriage to his unfaithful wife as an illustration of God's relationship with unfaithful Israel. It is a pretty rocky road, but it ends with restoration. Chapter 2, verse 14 to 23. Section 2, Hosea 3. This chapter is Hosea's own account of the very beginning of his marriage. It also speaks of his marriage as an illustration of God's relationship with Israel, but it approaches the issue from a somewhat different angle as compared to the first 2 chapters. Section 3, Hosea 4 to 14. This section is a mix of warnings, rebukes, admonitions, and pleas directed to Israel and to a lesser extent Judah. The main themes and teachings of the first 2 sections are also present here, but they are more developed. This is the section in which Hosea's message is most fully expressed. Hosea 3. Let's start with coming to understand the message of Hosea 3, since it is the shortest section, and since it was most likely the earliest written section of Hosea. We'll return to that shortly. The Lord said to me again, Go, love a woman who has a lover, and is an adulteress, just as the Lord loves the people of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, and a homer of barley, and a measure of wine. And I said to her, You must remain as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore. You shall not have intercourse with a man, nor I with you. For the Israelites shall remain many days without a king or prince, and without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or teraphim. Afterward the Israelites shall return, and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall come in awe to the Lord, and to his goodness in the latter days. Hosea 3:1-5, NRSV. What is the main point here? What was the message Hosea was given to bear? One thing that should be clear is that Hosea's marriage is used as an analogy for God's relationship with Israel. A careful examination of the chapter reveals the following parallels. Hosea, verse 1. Adulterous woman, verse 1. Lovers, verse 1. Many days without intimacy, verse 3. Return to Hosea, and intimacy implied. God's relationship with Israel. God, verse 1. Israel, verse 1. Other gods, verse 1. Many days without kings, prince, sacrifice, etc., verse 4. Return to God and David, verse 5. What a fascinating analogy, with a profound lesson. God could see that Israel was going after other gods, but wanted an intimate relationship with them anyway. God wanted to take Israel as his wife, but could see that she couldn't go straight from intimacy with other gods to intimacy with him. Therefore, there would have to be a period of chastity before their marriage could be consummated. The fact that remaining without sexual intercourse in verse 3 is parallel with going without kings, princes, sacrifices, etc. in verse 4 shows that all of the things mentioned in verse 4 are viewed as ways to be intimate with gods. The fact that Hosea's wife needed to abstain from intimacy with any man, including Hosea, illustrates that Israel would have to go without kingly and priestly intimacy with any god, whether foreign gods or God, the God of Israel. This makes sense in light of the fact that the Israel of Hosea's day combined the worship of Yahweh with that of other gods. It would thus be very difficult for them to have pure and undefiled intimacy with the true God. The goal of this period of chastity was so that afterward Israel could return to God to have intimacy with him alone, as indicated by the fact that they would also seek David their king, remembering that having a king is one of the ways to be intimate with a God. Verses 3 and 4. What did all this mean for Israel in Hosea's day? God saw that their kingship and their priesthood was so far off base and so defiled with adultery with other gods that the only way to solve it was to go without kingship and priesthood entirely, at least for a while. Just reforming the kingship and the priesthood wouldn't be enough. They needed a period of abstinence to rid themselves of their false conceptions and practices. Only after this could they come to God and have true intimacy. But why doesn't the last verse repeat the list of verse 4? Why doesn't it say, Afterward the Israelites shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and their sacrifice, and pillar, and ephod, and teraphim? Maybe they would seek those things, maybe not. What we can say is that the only point Hosea addressed directly is the kingship, which shows that that was the means of divine intimacy he wanted to emphasize above others. Take care.